Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for another session in our series on Israel-Palestine. Tonight, we're taking a look at the relationship between US-led imperialism and Israel, because we thought there is a lot of confusion, perhaps, on the issue, or a lot of simple formulas being used. Because, you look at the figures and you can understand why that comes about. The US pays more to Israel than all the other countries combined. So I've looked it up earlier, between 1946 and 2022, before the October 7 attacks, it spent $317 billion, that's adjusted for inflation, from the US to Israel. And under Barack Obama, he committed US to making record payments, a 10-year deal, and paid $3.8 billion a year. However, then October the 7th happened, and another $14.5 billion just in military aid in 2023. We're going to start looking at some of these issues in a bit more detail now, also historically. And then we're going to have a discussion on it. So we'd appreciate if comrades who want to get involved in discussion, click raise hand, and then we can bring you in afterwards. First, Roger Silverman, we're very pleased to have him with us, as well as Matthew Jones, of course. Roger is going to start giving a little introduction on the background to the relationship of the two countries. And then Matthew will look at the current situation, and then we'll have a discussion. So thank you all for joining. And Roger first, please.
Right. Hi, comrades. As you say, I'm going to deal more with the background and some general issues. I'm going to leave Matthew to do all the heavy lifting. I think would say for a start, anti-Semitic myths have a history stretching back a millennium. In medieval times, the story was, for instance, that they were killing children for their blood to make bread. But the stereotypical caricature that Jews constitute a secret conspiracy dates back to the emancipation, when they were formally released from the ghetto, and they were then represented by reaction either as a plutocratic cabal plotting to control the world, or simultaneously conspiratorial subversives undermining the establishment and the natural order. And I have to say that similar fantasies can still, believe it or not, be heard today. One American Trotskyist with whom I worked at the time, and himself a Jew, shocked me at one time when he was talking about the mysterious power over the US government, the stranglehold on US policy that Jews and Israel seem to have. Now, as the title of this session implies, this is an example of the tail wagging the dog. Zionism was a handy instrument seized on by British imperialism, most notably with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Why did Balfour promise British support for the creation of a Jewish state? It was made at a time, after all, when Zionism represented an outlandish sect within the Jewish communities, especially of Eastern Europe. It was a kind of counterpart to Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement in the USA, or the Rastafarians in the Caribbean. The attitude in the ghettos towards the Zionists, just as it was towards the fascist Black Hundreds, was, we're going nowhere. Where we live, that's our home. So what was Balfour's motivation in breathing life into Zionism? The policy was announced towards the end of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire had crumbled and Arab nationalist aspirations were growing. Zionism was cultivated as a strategic weapon just at the same time as Wahhabism was, to divide and rule in the Arab world. A Jewish homeland would serve as an outpost within the turbulent, oil-rich region to protect its control of the oil fields against the Arab Revolution and its control at that time of Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the sea route to British India. In the words of the first British military governor of Jerusalem, it would be, quote, a loyal little Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. To reverse the roles and misrepresent Balfour's policy as a takeover of Britain by the Jews would be ridiculous. One might just as well argue that Irish Protestants have some kind of mysterious power over the British ruling class. For a century, it has felt compelled to appease them, although by now they would be quite happy to cede the 6 counties to Ireland. In both countries and in all the territories ruled by the British Empire, a calculated policy was set in motion to promote communal conflict, and we still see the consequences in Ireland, the Indian subcontinent, in Sri Lanka, in Cyprus, in East Africa, and of course in the Middle East. The loyalists of Ulster and the Zionists were tools of the imperialists and not vice versa. Now, that Zionism by no means equated to a love for Jews is demonstrated by the comments of one reader of Herzl's book on Zionism. I'd like to give a quote from this reader. "The book interested me very much. Somehow it touched a chord in me and I took it all in." The author, Adolf Eichmann, who continued, "The Zionists wanted a territory where the Jewish people could finally settle in peace, and that was pretty much what the Nazis wanted." Of course, Eichmann went on to find a different solution. Zionism was an acknowledgement of despair, therefore. It was a capitulation to anti-Semitism. It was a lasting triumph of Nazism. In that sense, the genocide in Palestine today is yet another indirect aftershock of the failure of the German Revolution of 1918 to 1923. After the Second World War, Britain and the USA supported the establishment of a Jewish state for 2 reasons. First, to plant a surrogate regime amid the explosive powder keg of the region. But they also had a more immediate reason: to stop the hundreds of thousands of desperate Holocaust survivors, refugees from the concentration camps, now languishing in displaced persons refugee camps, from migrating en masse to Britain and America. The post-war Labour government was initially hostile to Zionism. Jewish survivors desperately seeking refuge somewhere they could begin to build a new life, free from the threat of extermination, risked their lives sailing rickety boats across the Mediterranean. And the boats of these Holocaust survivors were sunk by British warships and planes, just like the refugees travelling today across the Mediterranean are being sunk in the opposite direction. When the Labour right wing accuse us of anti-Semitism, we need to remind them that it was Herbert Morrison, Mandelson's grandfather, who as Home Secretary blocked asylum to Jews fleeing Nazi genocide, and Labour's right-wing Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, who drowned the Holocaust survivors in search of somewhere to live. They weren't looking to displace the Palestinians, still less to create a Jewish state. These survivors were simply looking for somewhere to live. But the Zionist forces in those days, who exploited these people, were at war with British imperialism. They were planting bombs, they were shooting soldiers and generals, they were blowing up hotels. The USA, too, was initially ambivalent about the creation of Israel. The first government to recognize the new state was actually the USSR. At the time of the Suez War, the USA sharply condemned the operation in which Israel colluded with Britain and France to attack Egypt. It was as British power shrank that Israel later became politically exploited by the USA to establish a dependent client state enclave as a bulwark against the Arab Revolution. Now, it is clearer than ever that it is clearer than ever what role Israel plays in the imperialist great power game. Now, anti-Semitism had become largely dormant in Britain before the smear campaign against Corbyn and the left had already breathed life back into it. It gave credibility to the old myth that there really is some secret worldwide Zionist conspiracy, that Jews somehow have a fiendish power to manipulate and control events. Many believe that Starmer and company are paid agents of the Israeli state. Now, of course, there were Israeli agents promoting the witch hunt. That's proved by documentary evidence. But what, after all, would we expect? The Israeli state has good reason to fear the election of a British Prime Minister with sympathies for the Palestinian cause. but it's a fatal mistake to miss the real target. Let's not exonerate the real enemy. Starmer, Blair, and Mandelson are first and foremost agents not of the Israeli, but of the British state, not of the Israeli, but the British ruling class. The anti-Semitism smear was an ingenious way of turning anti-racist sympathies to the service of the racist ruling class. Having failed to brand Corbyn a traitor or a KGB agent or even a pacifist weakling, to call him a racist was a masterstroke. The final proof that far from offering a protection against anti-Semitism, Zionism has placed Jews in even greater danger is we can just look at it today. The horrific genocide in Gaza has given further leverage to anti-Semitism. First of all, do the Jews in Israel feel safe today? Obviously not. Why else, when there were massive protest movements against the Netanyahu government before October the 7th, has that turned now into this apparently almost unanimous support? And throughout the diaspora, aren't the Jews exposed now to a new wave of hatred? A new variant of anti-Semitism is now rampant. Look at these examples from comments recently on Facebook. How can I ever feel comfortable discussing anything now with a Jew? Now, would we tolerate such comments about Muslims after 9/11, for instance? That came from somebody who proclaimed himself to be a sympathizer of the left. Another one. Now I understand why German workers didn't protest against the Holocaust. In other words, a planting of indiscriminate racist blame for the actions of Israeli fascists today on past generations. Another one. This is the worst atrocity in human history, which rather is a kind of implicit apology for the Holocaust, slavery, world wars, etc., etc. Israel is acting just the same way as any settler regime. Compare the extermination of indigenous populations in North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, throughout Africa, etc. There are even learned discourses on the internet now on whether or not the Jews have any genetic origins in Palestine, as if this had any relevance whatsoever to the issue. The point is that either Israel is a creature of imperialism and its armed watchdog over the strategically vital region, either we understand that without it, US and world imperialism would be disarmed and fatally weakened. And if we don't accept that interpretation of what is going on, then we have nothing left but to endorse reactionary, racist conspiracy theories. The idea that there's some secret, magical, hidden Jewish power manipulating the policies of the White House and the dominant powers belongs together with the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. Matthew will explain in further detail the real relationship of forces. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Roger. I think that's really important to explain that we have seen a rise, or there has been anti-Semitism. Of course, if the Jewish state, in the name of Jews, commits genocide, you would expect something like that to happen for sure. It was really good pointing out that it's mainly, this really strategic reason, isn't it, why the US is supporting Israel. We're going to look at these in a bit more detail now. Matthew, please.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is here, obviously, is that what we're dealing with is Israel as a client state. Obviously, it has a lobby inside the imperialist countries. You would expect it to, because obviously the decisions that happen in the imperialist countries, particularly obviously in Washington, as the imperial hegemon, affect it directly. So I mean, you would expect a huge effort to see it represented and attempt to represent its interests. Anyway, so I think the one question I think which has come up in the Q&A already was why did Stalin support Israel, which undoubtedly did. Actually, of course, that the first delivery of weapons to Israel was not from the US. It was from Czechoslovakia, from the Stalinists, and this enabled largely did a lot to enable the Nakba in 47, 48. And the answer to that, of course, is he was an anti-Semite, and anti-Semites do tend to support Zionists. I think the relationship really, I think, can be looked at between Israel and the US in particular, and the US as being imperial hegemon in terms of its military support, because Israel is probably the world's prime armed camp. I mean, it has been described as a military with a state attached, which is probably true. You know, in terms of it's one of the most militarized societies in the world, and also, of course, this is its prime value to the US as an armed camp that dominates the area that the US needs to dominate, and performs a strong point for the US. Now, this wasn't always the case. Okay, the US did actually recognize Israel relatively quickly after it proclaimed itself, but it did not have a great deal of relationship with it. It did provide a certain amount of economic support on a very low level. And the interesting thing, of course, is 1956, when the Israelis and the British and the French invaded Egypt and so on, in order to retake the control of the Suez Canal. You know, particularly, obviously, the British. Now, the thing is that the US at that point, actually, of course, had made a deal with the British. You know, at the end of the Second World War, look, you know, the handover is from you as the ex-hegemon, you know, the exhausted and bankrupt state, to us, the new hegemon, the guys who have, you know, half the world's productive capacity in one country, and you lot will give up your empire in an orderly fashion and allow us to run the world. And of course, the Americans saw the Suez invasion as the British and French reneging on this deal, the British in particular. And they said, basically, Eisenhower said to the British, you know, basically, you get out of there now, or we will wreck your economy, bring down the pound and so on. And the British turned around and left. And they also, of course, the Americans actually went around to the Israelis and actually walked the Israelis back to their own border and said, right, okay, you can, you know, you lot can move yourselves back, you know, out of the Gaza Strip, the whole lot, and back to where you started from. And they deliberately did that. So that was quite a different circumstance. You can also see that in 1963, where Kennedy was actually concerned about the US about the Israeli nuclear program, and actually instituted inspections in the Dimona nuclear plant to satisfy himself that the Israelis weren't planning anything particularly you know, against US interests with that plant. And those continued until the late 60s. The real change is in 67. The shift to the position you have now is in 67, where the Israelis obviously were able to win the Six-Day War, you know, against a larger Arab army, or series of Arab armies, and under conditions in which the Arab armies were supplied by the Soviet Union, and therefore, you know, the US could quite clearly see here's a reliable ally, militarily organized, able to beat the local competition, and able to keep down these guys. You know, I mean, despite, as Yasmin said last week, the relation, you know, Nasser in Egypt protesting to the Americans that he was on their side, he was anti-communist and so on. He was forced to rely, you know, they wouldn't sell him weapons. He was forced to rely on the Soviet Union to purchase his weapons and so on. So there was a relationship, you know, between all these countries and Russia, basically, or the Soviet Union. So in those terms, it worked. And actually what happened then, of course, was in 68 that Johnson actually decided that they were going to sell, you know, relatively new military technology to the Israelis and prop up the Israeli regime in military terms. This is then actually enhanced in the 73 Yom Kippur War, in which the Americans staged a vast airlift, actually with the assistance of the Portuguese, because obviously the Portuguese at this point hadn't had their revolution and therefore could be a cat coup. Well, they were on the point of it, but they could use the Portuguese airstrips in the Azores in order to run an airlift into Israel, in which they just delivered over 22,000 tons of military gear within a very short space of time in order to prop up the Israeli military effort. And from then on, basically, you've seen this constant American support to Israel. I'll just shove something up on the screen, and you can see the prime thing. The prime thing in the relationship here, obviously, as you see, is the blue bars, which are military relations. So you can see in '74, which is immediately, because obviously US years are slightly staggered and all the rest of it. So you can see this massive effort in '74, at which.
Matthew, could you zoom in a little bit? It's quite small.
Quite small, okay.
If you do what do you call it? That's slightly better. But if you do slideshow.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get it to do that. Anyway, so you can see this in '74, and you can see, that it's fairly constant in terms of, that's easier to see, I hope.
Now it's better. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks. So you can see there's a fairly constant. This is in 2022 dollars. So obviously it's not. It's allowed for inflation. So you can see in '74 the effort for the '73 war, because obviously US budget years are not the same as real years. But you can see a fairly steady and very high level of support for the Israelis from the Americans, with peaks obviously at certain points, and of course the enormous 14.3 billion effort in 2023, which it doesn't include the bill that they're currently trying to get through Congress. This just includes, because actually the Americans shipped 10. By the 6th of December, they'd shipped $10,000 tons of assorted military gear, including ammunition and so on and so forth, to the Israelis in order to supply much of the effort to attack Gaza. So the interesting thing, really, as I say, apart from that, is the points at which there were disagreements, and there's certain disagreements, and actually in 1982 there's an interesting disagreement over the invasion of Lebanon, in which the Americans were trying to negotiate a deal, and the Israelis were attempting to continue attacking Beirut, etc., and particularly obviously the positions of the Syrians, the PLO in Lebanon, and the Americans, in the form of Ronald Reagan, had got really pissed off, because obviously the two were essentially crossing. I mean, this was causing them real issue in terms of maintaining their prestige, etc. And he actually told them to stop. He said, "You must stop," and they did, because obviously they're completely dependent. So if the Americans say stop, they will stop. I think there's another couple of there's a few other things in these terms also that are really significant. One obviously is the assorted bits of the peace process, or quoted peace process between which is essentially the Americans then acting to effectively take over patronage of Egypt in the '70s, and do a deal between the Israelis and the Egyptians, squeeze out the Soviet Union from Egypt, and make a formal peace. The other one, of course, is the same process in terms of after the fall of the Soviet Union and the effort to collapse the Palestinian liberation movement in the '90s, with alleged peace between the PLO and Israel, which essentially instituted the PLO as being a client of the Israelis, effectively providing the security detail for the Israelis in the occupied territories, for which, of course, they are now hated. So, plus the other thing, of course, is the institution in '85. The Americans instituted a free trade deal with Israel, Israel, of course, has a particular status in terms of its relations with the US. The first being free trade deal in '85, the second being the institution of a status major non-NATO ally, which went through in 1989, which then essentially allows the institution of a very close relationship, a relationship so close that in fact the Americans have got depots of arms in Israel itself for their use and for the use of the Israelis should they need them. They also have very close relations in terms of the actions of their military, which I'll go into a little more in a minute. In terms of what's then happened, subsequent development in 2008, which is significant, was the move for the U.S. Congress, the whole passed an act which included the notion that Israel should be able to maintain a qualitative military advantage over all of its neighbours put together, which is formally in US law, so that the Americans will provide enough arms that continues. So in those terms, it really is quite a lock in terms of dominating an entire area. It also means, of course, at the same time that the Israelis are dependent on the Americans, that they need to agree with the Americans their military operations. And in fact, if you look at the latest operation in Gaza, the attack on Gaza, on October the 8th, if you go into the log of the White House, it actually notes that Biden, and there was a telephone call between Biden and Netanyahu, in which Biden basically says, well, you go ahead and do what you want. We'll supply the weapons. And not only that, just because he was a generous man and obviously basically genocide Joe, Biden also supplied the Israelis with a 3-star Marine Corps general to assist in the planning of the assault on Gaza. So the assault on Gaza is actually the responsibility of the US government as much as it is of the Israeli government. So you can see how closely they are integrated together. I'll go through, there's a couple of other slides. So you can see here, this is imports of arms from the United States to Israel, and Israel is totally dependent on that relationship from the US as imperial hegemon, and as I say, it means that the Israeli military is effectively integrated and has to obey American commands, not the other way around. This quote, which is brilliant. Joe Biden, of course, is one of the world's great Zionists, and he said this. He's been obviously he was in the Senate from the early 70s, and he's said this on multiple occasions going back decades. This is a quote from the celebration of the independence of Israel in April 2015, in which he's basically saying, well, if we didn't have Israel, we'd have to invent it because it does the job that we need to. But obviously there are differences between the two. I mean, you can look at it really. I mean, the way I look at it is Israel's like a dog on a leash. I mean, obviously the dog has its own interests. It doesn't do exactly what it's told, but it knows where the other end of the leash is. Which quite clearly is in Washington. Finally, this is also useful in terms of looking at the trade of Israel. If you want to look at that, and say I think it's secondary to the military relationship. Principally, the export is to the United States because obviously of the free trade agreement, which allows the Israeli economy to operate in those terms. It's something the US has done with a number of other countries. South Korea comes to mind. There's a few others. And you can then also see the relationship with the European countries as being important in there as well. That the US is the largest single operator in those terms. So in those, as I say, I think that to sum up, that what we're looking at is a relation between the imperial hegemon, but one that is declining and in the case of degeneration, one that has shifted to war. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, once the Soviet Union is dissolved, then the US basically, goes to full on. We will continue to have wars all the time in various parts of the world, and in an effort to maintain its own power. Many times, these wars, of course, backfire. I mean, we've seen, the disaster in Iraq, which is, disastrous, first of all, for people in Iraq, but also for US imperialism. We've seen a disaster in Afghanistan. The same applies. We've seen a disaster in Ukraine, in which clearly, Biden is incapable of producing anything out of that, other than obviously a lot of dead people. And we're now seeing a disaster in Israel, because obviously we're seeing, as people have said, really the end point. We're starting to see the end point of the whole Zionist project. But the question really then is how much blood is involved, and the fact that it's the poor Palestinians who are really suffering the consequences of this decline and fall. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you, Roger. I think before we open up for comments and contributions from the floor, I have a little discussion with you quickly, and let's try to bring it to a point that I think, Matthew, you did a good job there, saying that you think Israel is the dog on the leash, and I see it more that way around as well. I could see from the chat though that there's a bit of a difference of opinion with other comrades there. So let's see. I mean, like looking back now, let's concretely the relationship of US and Israel. I mean, it's and we had this discussion last week looking at Nasser and the Arab Revolution, and it was quite clear, and Yasmin explained what the reason was there for the US to support Israel as a bulwark against those Arab revolutions, etc., and propping up financially one theocratic leader against another, and then you have all kinds of unintended consequences of organizations developing supported with US money that then didn't actually quite do what you wanted them to do. So, and how the power shifted after World War II, and it's been moved on from the US, from Britain and France to the US. I think that was all very, very clear. Today, then, looking at today, I mean, it's quite easy to see why Israel needs the US. It's a mutual relationship for sure, but the Israel needs the US in order to continue its campaign of genocide against the Palestinians. Clearly, if the US wasn't there to protect Israel, it would have a very hard time continuing this campaign, and would be probably under sanction when it comes to UN, etc., which the UN has tried before, and nothing come of it. But then today, what's in it for the US, really? Is it oil? Is it, I mean, you mentioned war. Is it other strategic interests? First to you, Roger, and then Matthew. In a few sentences, if you can, what's in it for both sides? What do you think?
I'm not sure if I can add anything to what I said. What's in it for both sides? Israel, of course, needs the protection of Israel. It needs the protection of the USA. It needs the armaments. It needs the financial aid. It couldn't survive without them. The USA needs Israel because they have to protect their interests in this vitally important strategic, economically strategic area of the world, the control of the oil fields, etc., and as a hedge against the revolution, which is, I mean, all of the countries around Israel are bubbling with civil war, with discontent, with potential uprisings or actual uprisings and so on. And Israel is a godsend to them as a sort of area, or has been as an area of stability. Of course, that stability is getting completely wrecked now. I don't think we couldn't rule out the possibility that at some stage in the future, America could shift its base in the Middle East. There's no. I mean, the idea that there's. I mean, it's all very well for people in the chat to say, of course there are conspiracies. Of course there are conspiracies. There are lots of conspiracies. What we talk about is whether this one can be ascribed to some kind of conspiracy by the Jews to somehow control the most powerful economy and political state on earth. And I just think it's obvious, if we're a Marxist, we have to understand that people have material motives and material interests. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Matthew?
Yeah, I think the thing is that clearly in geostrategic terms, I mean, obviously the Middle East is important. I mean, in terms of both the supply of oil, but also in global terms. I mean, the US as hegemon wishes to maintain its dominance of the world, and the Middle East is central. So I mean, the thing is obviously having your own armed camp in the middle of it, it is strategically extremely important. And I mean, obviously the thing is, you look at it, the US, of course, has fomented a war with Russia, and seeks to destroy Russia, and is working towards a war with China. Essentially, we're seeing, if it's not stopped, I mean, the process towards World War III. That's what it is, and you can see. I mean, the whole thing is, it requires an anchor in those terms, so that the Israelis are very useful in those terms. I mean, the thing is, obviously, for the Israelis' point of view, they wouldn't survive without US and other imperialist patronage. But I mean, the thing is, the other imperialist powers are important, but they are second line. They're subordinate to the US.
And that's an interesting subject that Roger mentioned. There is nothing lasts forever. I mean, you could see that the US, with a change of president or not, could just say, well, maybe Saudi Arabia is now stable enough, or we have a hold on that, and we don't need Israel anymore. Can you see Israel with sort of US withdrawing funding?
It's been remarkably consistent, actually. I mean, the thing is, bits and pieces. If you look at the thing about American foreign policy when it comes to these sort of things like this, is it is remarkably consistent. I mean, whatever there's sort of words and so on and so forth, but they carry on the same line. Really. I mean, there's bits and pieces around the edges, but the line is the same. You can see quite clear continuity between Trump and Biden, for instance, and what they've done. And then going back, into Obama and Bush Jr. and so on and so forth. There's never, and it's not a case of, I mean, you can look at it and say, well, personally, of course, there is and it's known that Netanyahu and Biden can't abide each other. They can't stand each other. They hate each other, really. But the point is that in material terms, they have to stick together. It's business. It's imperialism.
So, Roger, you don't see an ending of support anytime soon, and with the possibility of a World War III, which I agree we're much closer now than we've ever been before. That this relationship is lasting a little while longer.
If you're asking me to predict now, I would never have predicted the Holocaust, the genocide of Gaza. It came completely out of the blue. I know we're supposed to be clairvoyant Marxists and to understand and to predict, but all we can say is it's such a completely explosive, unstable situation in the Middle East especially, but in the world as a whole, that nothing can be ruled out. So I'm sorry, that's not a very particularly useful answer, but I think that's the most honest answer I can give.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to bring in Tony now, who's said in the chat that he disagrees with a few things, but also might ask some questions or open up some new areas of discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. Can everyone see me?
Yeah.
There you are. Certainly, the United States sees Israel as a stable settler base, and quite rightly so. And I think what Reagan's Secretary of State, whose name escapes me for the moment.
Baker, was it?
Who?
Baker.
No, that wasn't Jim.
Schultz.
Baker. Alex Haig.
Alexander Haig.
Yeah, well, he said actually support for Israel, which was about $4 billion a year, I think then, was cheap at the price. It was an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and there wasn't even one American soldier involved in this fighting. And I think that is true, because I used to ask myself, is there anything Israel can do which the United States would disapprove of and halt its aid to? And the answer in Gaza is no, there is actually nothing that Israel can do which the United States won't go along with all the caveats, with all the kind of mopping of the brow and, the plaintive wringing of the hands of Blinken. The fact is they're still supplying them with the weapons. And when it came to the International Court hearing, what did America say? It was meritless, South Africa's case, without foundation, not based on fact. And yet, of course, we saw through the brilliant exposition of the Irish KC that it was anything but that. It was methodical, and the court accepted there was a plausible genocide. But I do disagree with Roger in his whole analysis of the post-45 situation. And really, we need to go back. Zionism was a movement that was created. It was an independent movement. It was the most reactionary section of the Jewish population. Originally, Zionism was a Christian evangelical idea. It wasn't a Jewish idea at all. And from the start, from Herzl, they sought an imperialist patron. And in 1917, they got one. I mean, there'd been intimations earlier, but the Balfour Declaration, Balfour himself was a dedicated anti-Semite. There was an alliance between British imperialism and Zionism. And without British imperialism, Zionism would never have got a foothold. It simply wasn't strong enough, and it would have been driven out. However, during the war, when Zionism did attain a center of gravity, if you like, a mass, a vital mass of population, thanks to Hitler. And when I said at a seminar, the Palestine Expo, about 4 years ago, that Israel was Hitler's bastard offspring, the Jewish Chronicle went to town and threw up its hands in horror. But it's actually true. Without Adolf Hitler, it's questionable, to say the least, whether the Israeli state would have had the critical mass in order to establish itself. But during the war, the Zionist movement, which was politically very adept, it shouldn't be underestimated, it had an internal debate, in essence, about switching imperialist partners between the United States and Britain, because it was quite clear the United States was on the up and Britain was on the down. And that was epitomized in two figures in the Zionist movement: Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, and then the president of the Zionist organization, who was pro-British, and David Ben-Gurion, who was the chair of the Jewish Agency and Israel's first prime minister, who was pro-Israel. And that is the context in which the Zionist militias after 1945, and even before 1945, in terms of the Irgun and Lehi, attacked the British forces. But they didn't do so as anti-imperialists. They were thoroughly pro-imperialist, in the same way as when the Boers went to war with the British in South Africa. They didn't do it from an anti-racist or anti-imperialist perspective. It was, if you like, it was a fighting out amongst the thieves. The thieves had fallen out, and the same was true in Palestine. But it's not true that the British government under Bevin was anti-Zionist. It wasn't anti-Zionist. I mean, it still supported the Zionists in Palestine. it held back the Palestinian resistance, and indeed, in many ways, fatally undermined it, and it held back its own army in Jordan, which Gulab Pasha, which was under the control of Britain, and conspired in many ways to weaken the Palestinians, even though it was being fought. And senior figures in the Labour Party at that time actually supported the Zionist attacks on the British troops. Richard Crossman, for one, who later became a cabinet minister under Harold Wilson. So it's not true. Roger talks about the boats which were sunk. I'm not aware that the British sunk any boats of any Holocaust survivors, and I'll be interested for the names of those boats. The only operation was Operation Embarrass, which was a secret MI6 operation, which was about disabling the boats and planting a bomb on one of them in Italian ports. The only sinking of refugee ships was one, the Strooman, I think 1943, when 800 survivors, Holocaust survivors, lost their lives, and only one survived. We don't know what happened with that. It is a complete mystery. The other one was the Patria in the harbor of Haifa, and that was sunk by Haganah. And Haganah sunk it because they preferred the Holocaust survivors to die, and therefore to make the symbolic protest, than for them to be shipped to Mauritius. I mean, that is the reality. The British stopped the boats, the British boarded the boats, the British tried to deport them to Cyprus, Mauritius, and other places. I'm not aware that they sank, but the real situation is this, that during the Second World War, the Zionists were vehement in opposing any rescue scheme for Jewish refugees whose destination was not Palestine, because in their view, the only task at hand was building a Jewish state, and to save Jews from any other place would render the Jewish state worthless. There would be no point in it. And so when Herbert Morrison in 1942 turned down the application of thousands of Jews, 2,000 plus Jews who were in Vichy, France, the Vittel detainees, who were on the brink of being deported to Auschwitz, the Zionists did not oppose that. They supported Morrison throughout. They had no problem with Holocaust refugees not surviving. They only used them as a battering ram to get into Palestine. And we know in the displaced persons camp that the Haganah viciously attacked the Bundist survivors of the Holocaust, because the Bundists did not want to go to Palestine either. And that is admitted. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. So, I mean, we need to look at the Zionist role. They suppressed the desire of most of the Holocaust survivors in the displaced persons camp to go to the USA and Britain. And in America, the Zionists opposed lowering the immigration barriers. They were quite key in that campaign. They aided, if you like, the anti-Semites who opposed Jews coming in, and not to mention that I think is quite remarkable. As regards the genetic association and the new variant of anti-Semitism, I don't accept this at all. Racism without state power is really just a prejudice. And of course, there are some people in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, very few incidentally, who look at it as the Jews. The real problem is that the British bourgeoisie, and not just the British, the Americans as well, are adopting Jews as almost their colonial pets in terms of anti-Semitism. So only today we hear of a £5.5 million programme in the schools in Britain to fight anti-Semitism. Of course, the anti-Semitism of the IHRA, not genuine anti-Semitism. It's this adoption of Jews by the various bourgeois states, Germany, Britain, the United States, and so on, as a pretext, a moral pretext for their support for Israel, which I think should be worrying. The actual incidence of anti-Semitism is remarkably low, considering that Israel does everything it does in the name of the Jews. What else? This genetic association. Well, the whole claim of Zionism to a Jewish state is that Jews are returning, that they are genetically associated. It's not surprising that people sometimes come up with evidence which suggests that this is not true. I don't think this is particularly anti-Semitic. It's, if anything, a reaction to the anti-Semitism of the Zionist movement. I think that's important to mention. As regards the Suez because of course there was, after the war, there was a continual tussle between Britain and America. Britain didn't just give way, it fought every inch of the way to retain its foothold in the Middle East. And that's why Stalin so stupidly backed the Zionists. He thought that was the way to get the British out, but the British were going anyway because the United States wanted them out, because it wanted to be the economic superpower in the Middle East. And Suez was the culmination of that. And of course, as Matthew said, when Britain and France conducted their agreement, the secret agreement, together with the French at Sèvres, the United States stepped in and instituted a run on the pound, and Britain very quickly got the message that it wouldn't economically survive. And that was then the beginning of the so-called independent nuclear deterrent Polaris with the Americans. Of course, it's not independent either, but that really is the context. And all this stuff about Holocaust survivors going to Palestine, well, they were going as settlers. That is a fact. And 1/3 of those who fought in the 1948 war were Holocaust survivors. And by all accounts, they were the worst, which just goes to show that victims can sometimes become perpetrators as well. But I say the main lesson to be drawn is that Israel is supported by the United States, not for love of Jews, but for love of its own interests. Whether it will ever dissociate, I somehow doubt. It's not impossible. It is possible that it will dissociate, but it will take revolution in the Arab East, I think, to dislodge it from that position, by which time it will be immaterial anyway. But for the moment, the United States has made it very, very clear where it stands. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Just the last question quickly. Do you agree with how Matthew put it, that it's sort of Israel is the dog, if you want that kind of analogy?
Well, yes, it's a racist Rottweiler, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, Israel likes to portray itself as a mad dog because it thinks then the Palestinians and the Lebanese will think it's irrational, and therefore they won't provoke it. I mean, it deliberately cultivates that image. Yes.
It'd be good if you could stay with us if you want,
sure.
Tony, because
Yeah,
there
yeah,
might
yeah.
be disagreements coming along. Roger, do you want to reply to some of what Tony was saying just now?
Yes, most of what Tony says I actually agree with. I think maybe I've expressed it badly, and maybe he misunderstood what I was saying. First of all, of course, I never said that the Zionists were ever anti-imperialist. I simply drew attention to the fact that the Zionists, the Zionist militias were fighting against British imperialism, fighting against the occupation by Britain in their interests. Of course, they're not anti-imperialist. As for the question of the boats, well, it was my information that I read it, and I'll check my sources. But I do, obviously, I know that Tony is an expert on the issue, and I may be mistaken on that. But nevertheless, it surely is not wrong to point out that until the establishment of Israel in 1948, that the British Labour government was preventing the emigration of Jews, and largely of Holocaust survivors, to Israel. And that's I don't think I'm surprised, if you like, that he's questioned that. On the other questions, well, he says it's not surprising that these questions are raised about genetics and so on. Of course, it's not surprising. It's not surprising that with the horrors of the genocide in Gaza, it's not surprising that it has given rise to and given some kind of substance to anti-Semitic feelings. I'm not saying that it's a major threat, but I think it's something to watch and something to speak out against. We have to call out when people say things like, how can I ever talk to a Jew again? People who claim to be socialists, then I think we have to call it out. So we have to say that's absolutely, it's completely wrong. It's completely outrageous to blame that, to talk about, now I know why the German workers were not opposed to the Holocaust. I mean, that is an outrageous comment. I'm not saying that it's very widespread. I'm saying that where we see signs of it, we need to stamp it out. Maybe I'll come back later if there's other things raised.
Yeah. Because I do think I want to bring in Ian Donovan because he does have a different view, and it'd be good to hear somebody who doesn't agree with the analysis we've just heard. I trust that's where you're coming from.
Hang on one second. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm not going to speak for too long because I've got a few notes and things. I've put quite a lot of what I have to say in the chat. But I do think this is a mechanical view of what's going on, and I think it's there's a very common left view that simply portrays Israel as a lackey of US imperialism, and before that a lackey of British imperialism. But it didn't actually behave like that when at certain crucial junctures in history. I mean, the obvious example is the King David Hotel, which was a huge military blow against Britain, which basically forced the British to evacuate in a couple of years. From its role as overseer of the Palestine mandates. It basically skedaddled after that, and the Zionists had effectively kicked them out. Likewise, when the Americans intervened, they were sort of buzzing around the edges of and getting in the way at the time of the 6 Day War or just afterwards. They sank the USS Liberty, and basically the Americans have had to eat it. Anybody who raises this in America gets accused of anti-Semitism, whether they're coming from a nationalist standpoint or from any other sort of criticism of it. And I think it's wrong to talk about anybody who who raises questions about the role of Zionism in the world is anti-Semitic or is echoing the protocols of the Elders of Zion or something. First of all, the Nazis actually caricatured things that were, at least in embryonic form, real, and we're now seeing that I think Zionism was seen as a potential rival in some ways, and that's explained some of the elements of what became the genocide. But I also think that what people said about Storrs, Storrs' famous remarks about Israel will be a loyal little Jewish Ulster. It's not loyal. It was never loyal. It's loyal to itself. And Joe Biden says that if Israel is an aircraft carrier, and if it didn't exist, it'd have to invent it. But really, would they have to invent it? It doesn't make much sense because if you look at the relationship of the United States with the Arab and Muslim world today, it's never been worse, right? They are facing millions of strong anti-American demonstrations as far away as Indonesia, an incredible hostility right across the Arab world, the Muslim world, from Morocco to Indonesia. It's a huge area of the world, hugely strategically important. And they're blowing it. They're driving people into the arms of the Russians, in their terms, as geopolitical rivals. BRICS is growing, and it's recruited Egypt, it's recruited Saudi Arabia, it's recruited the UAE, and it will probably recruit Indonesia. This is not in the interests of US imperialism, which sees China and Russia as its main strategic enemies, not really the Arab states that face Israel. And it doesn't make sense from a world strategic aspect. There is an explanation for it, and it is that the bourgeoisie is not strictly rational. The imperialist bourgeoisies are not strictly rational. They have cults amongst themselves, and Hitler was an example. Actually, they allowed Hitler to do some amazingly irrational things from the point of view of German imperialism. Well, now the US is doing some amazingly irrational things because its fixation, it virtually worships the elements of the Zionist movement partly because of what happened in the 70s, where Friedman and neoliberalism, they think it saved their system. And they regard them as a class-conscious reserve, as a vanguard that could save their system again in the future. And I think that's what's responsible for this. It is a peculiar thing because strategically Israel is wrecking American power, actually, particularly soft power. Support for Israel is blowing it with wide areas of the world and causing that, driving everybody into the hands of the US's strategic rivals as it sees it. It really doesn't make sense. And I think there's a sort of mechanical Marxism involved in this. You know, like the classic an example of that in history is in the history of post-war Marxism is Jerry Healy in the face of the Cuban Revolution, where he basically said, "Well, we can't got a split theory that can explain how a communist regime can be created in Cuba. So we'll deny reality. Say Cuba is still capitalist. There hasn't really been a revolution in Cuba." And they concoct all sorts of what's the word, spurious theories to try and justify that, and it made them a laughing stock. And I think it makes a lot of the left the laughing stock when they deny any independent agency of Zionism and any independent power of Zionism in the imperialist countries, because it doesn't really make sense, you know, from the point of view of imperialist strategy, some of the things they're doing. And they'll pay for it. They will pay for it. Don't worry, they will. Anyway, I'm just some food for thought. Anyway, I don't want to lecture people for too long, but I think I do have a different view. Yeah, and hopefully that will give people something to think about. Cheers.
Sounded like it, yeah. Does anybody want to reply to Ian? Okay, Matthew first. I think, yeah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things in there. You know, I mean, you start with the USS Liberty, and if people don't know what the USS Liberty was, it was a CIA listening ship, which the Americans sent to basically listen in to the communications of the Israelis as they attacked Egypt in particular in the 67 Six-Day War. The Israelis attacked the ship, I mean, both from the air and with torpedo boats. And as a result, they killed a large proportion of the crew and injured another load of people and nearly sank the ship. Now, I mean, the thing is, I mean, clearly, you know, serious incident. The crew, some of the crew is still alive, think that they've been hard done to, which they probably have been, because obviously the Americans then said, well, okay, we shall go and ally ourselves with the Israelis. But what are the stakes? I mean, the thing is, obviously, the problem is Americans are quite willing to sell their own people, you know, especially, you know, a shipload of their own people in you know, under conditions in which they can get, they want an alliance, you know, which is obviously being extremely significant to them. So, I mean, in those terms, you know, they would be prepared to forgive that kind of transgression. I think it wouldn't happen now. Because they're the two sides are too integrated. I mean, you know, it's obvious, you know, there wasn't the integration between the two militaries and intelligence services and so on and so forth that there is now. So, in those terms, it's, you know, it exists as an anomaly. Now, in terms of I mean, the thing is, the extraordinary thing, of course, is these Russians have no particular beef with the Israelis whatsoever. They have quite good relations with them, actually. They're not anti-imperialist in that sense. There's actually a deal, there's a floating deal, as people have pointed out, between the Russians, who actually control Syrian airspace these days, and the Israelis. So the Israelis actually have to say to the Russians, look, we're going to conduct an air raid in Syria. Make sure your guys are nowhere near it. Because obviously we don't want to bump into each other in the skies over Syria. So they don't, and it works. So that's how it's done. You know, the Russians don't want to have a fight with the Israelis. You know, and everybody conducts their business. I mean, I agree with Ian. I mean, the thing is about imperialism is disintegrating. That's the point. I mean, it's disintegrating both in world terms and in terms of its own the condition of the US itself. I mean, look at it. You know, it's falling apart. You know, you would expect this. The contradictions are bursting out all over the shop. I mean, the thing is, and as I say, internally as well as externally. So I mean, obviously they maintain their alliance with the Israelis, and also, of course, with all the Arab regimes. I mean, the US has probably never had better relations with most of the Arab regimes, which are quite lined up. You know, if you look at it, you know, the US has bases across much of the Middle East, which the regimes are quite happy to give them, including, as it turns out, of course, the Jordanians, who are deeply embarrassed by the fact that they've got secret American bases in there with thousands of troops. Including all the Gulf kingdoms who have been apparently who were discovered to be secretly supplying the Israelis by road because the Houthis are stopping them doing it by ship. You know, these people don't have it. The actual regimes themselves have no issue with the Zionists. They don't care. You know, but what's killing a few tens of thousands of people are these characters, you know, like the Saudis or the Gulf kingdoms or the Jordanians. They don't give a shit. The impact, of course, is on the masses. I mean, you know, this is the problem they've got, of course, is the populations, of course, have a quite different view. That they see rightly that their interests lie with the Palestinians. So it actually, you know, puts in terms of a struggle against the regimes themselves and the imperialists at the same time. The whole thing is stirred up, you know, and it has to be looked at in those ways. And in terms of, as I say, the disintegration of capitalism, of imperialism, and of US imperialism itself.
Thanks, Matthew. Tony, I think you wanted to say something in terms.
Yeah, I mean, you can often argue, as Ian was, that the United States supporting Israel is not in its own interest, but I think it's a really dangerous game for socialists to get into, to say what is in imperialism's best interest, because imperialism is the best judge of its own interests, and it may not see things in the same way as we do. Apart from the fact it's incredibly short-termist, this is capitalism generally. It doesn't really look at anything in the long term. That's the nature of the beast. But I would think, in terms of the regimes which now exist in the Arab East, America really has got the ideal kind of regimes throughout the Gulf and so on. And where it doesn't, like in Iran, it makes clear its disapproval. But the Arab Gulf sheikdoms and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt are in its pocket. I think it is as good as it gets. And as Matthew said, there are vast bases, Qatar, Bahrain, and so on, where Britain and America have their bases and they police the region. I mean, the problem is that until there is an Arab revolution which overthrows the rotten order in the Arab East, you will continue to get that. I mean, I think it's ironic. It was South Africa, not any Arab state, that brought the legal case at the International Court of Justice, because that is the legacy of the anti-apartheid struggle. Just as it's ironic that it's the South American regimes, I think of Belize and is it Ecuador, which have cut off relations with Israel. It isn't Jordan or Egypt or the Gulf sheikdoms that have done that. But Israel historically has acted very decisively against the Arab nationalist regimes. It aided Saudi Arabia in the counterinsurgency war it conducted in Yemen in the 50s and 60s against the revolutionary groups there. And I mean, that's what it was doing when it fought the Houthis in Yemen more recently. And it's ironic, therefore, it is only the Houthis who've come, if you like, to the aid of the Palestinians in Gaza. But I really do think there's a problem if we try and say, well, this isn't in America's interest. The fact is that the American bourgeoisie overwhelmingly sees it as in their interests. And I don't think it's for us to say, well, it's not in your interest. These are really what your interests are. I don't think socialists should get into that game, to be quite honest.
I don't think it would work.
You could even say the same thing, actually, of the Iranians. The Iranians don't really have a beef with the Israelis either.
No, I mean,
they're not anti-imperialists.
They're not
if you look at Iran-Contra, the regime was quite happy to deal with back channels to the Israelis. And actually, if the US offered the Iranians a deal that they could live with, they would happily take it tomorrow.
Yes, absolutely. And on anti-Semitism, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out, because people continually forget it, the most anti-Semitic movements and groups and parties in the world are the ones that give Israel the most support, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary, or indeed the AfD in Germany, which is riding at 20% plus in the polls. It's overridden with neo-Nazis, Holocaust deniers, and other detritus. And yet, when it comes to Israel, it's the most pro-Zionist party. It would make BDS illegal at a stroke. And the same in America. Trump, I mean, he's anti-Semitic, but he loves Israel. I mean, that's where the anti-Semitism comes from. It's from Israel's own supporters.
Thank you. Roger, did you want to say anything on that? Or shall we?
I don't really have anything more to add.
Okay,
I think it's been a very good discussion.
Yeah, we've got some more comrades who want to ask questions or have comments. Cheryl, please.
Hi, yeah, I mean, some of the points that I was going to raise have already been raised, but I'm wondering whether or not America is beginning to feel afraid it will no longer be the world superpower, especially with the BRICS countries and their aim to for de-dollarization. And so whether or not that they have so fiercely supported this war is in relation to their fear of losing their own power as the world's superpower. And I suppose the other thing I wanted to raise was about the resources in the area, the gas fields which are in, I think, the north of Israel. There's gas fields off the coast of Gaza, so there's lots of reasons, I would imagine, why America wants to keep grip of supporting Israel. The other thing that I wanted to say is in relation to the axis of resistance, which is the Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis, and recently there's been attacks on the US soldiers by the Iraqi militants. It seems like the whole area is, I mean, it's all really boils down to oil and who's in control of resources, because it wasn't until I went on quite a few educational webinars with comrades from the Middle East, that you realise how complicated, like, the whole picture is of, the Kurds being aligned to the Americans because of oil, and because there's been so many attacks and counterattacks in that region recently, it's really difficult to make sense of who's doing what to who and why. But evidently the root of it all is about who controls the oil, who controls power, which is why the the Saudis' grip on the parts of Yemen, they still have a grip on the Saudi still controls the most wealthiest resource area, oil-rich area in Yemen. And the other thing I just wanted to mention is to do with Saudi, that they have recently made a statement that they will not agree to normalization unless there is a Palestinian state. And Hamas have recently said that they want the guarantors of their agreement to be Russia, United Nations, Turkey, Qatar. So I suppose what I'm saying, probably in quite a muddled way, is that the whole sort of dynamics of who controls what and oil are so complicated that to just see it through the prism of America and Israel is just like a bit tunnel vision, because it's the whole wider geopolitics, not just only of the region, but like the whole of the world. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl. Anybody wants to reply to that? Does it boil down to oil?
I mean, I'll say briefly, I think there's a few, obviously the problem with for the people using the dollar, of course, actually, obviously, given, I think there's two factors in that. One obviously is the decline of the US itself, and the other one that's actually caused a major rupture has, of course, been the sanctions on Russia, because what the Americans have done is to seize dollar assets. And what that says is, well, okay, your money ain't your money if it's in dollars, because if it's in dollars, we'll have it off you if we don't like the look of you. And that really does raise issues for all sorts of people, so that really, opens that, a big can of worms in those terms. So in terms of the Saudi deal, I mean, the thing is, the Saudis were quite happy to have a deal with the Israelis. It's actually one of the prompts for the breakout on October the 7th was the fact the Saudis were about to sign a deal with the Israelis, and of course, what it did was to destroy that. That's going to happen. But the problem they've got, of course, is that the populations of Arab countries are incredibly anti-Israeli. I mean, the problem, you can go right across the region, everywhere. The regimes, of course, are not. They don't give a shit. But it really creates an issue for them. Where you've got Jordan, where they tried to burn the Israeli embassy and the US embassy, and you can go through all the countries and everybody's, really, really hostile. I mean, to a tremendous degree, and businesses now are being driven out of the Middle East. A whole series of businesses, multinational businesses, because people just won't buy anything off them anymore. Because the whole population is basically, we're not dealing with these people because you're obviously in bed with the Zionists. So in those terms, it's moving things politically and socially quite a lot. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Tony or Roger, did you want to say anything?
Not at this stage. If I could come back later.
Okay. How about you, Tony?
I mean, Cheryl's right. It's not just about oil. I mean, that's very clear from the Houthis attack that the Suez Canal is a vital artery for all sorts of trade because it's much easier and cheaper and quicker to go through the Suez Canal and therefore along the Red Sea than it is to go around the Cape of Good Hope. But also it's in terms of, if you like, overall dominance, full spectrum dominance in the sense of the United States in terms of its military posture, because the United States under Biden was not particularly interested in the Middle East until all of this blew up. He'd put it on a back burner. He wasn't really interested in his presidency in that. He was more interested in the pivot to China via the AUKUS Pact. I mean, because China is the second major, well, in fact, the major competitor against the United States economically and to a greater extent militarily. And we've also seen that Ukraine has dropped off the agenda. And there may be real differences between Biden and Trump in terms of how the approach is to the Ukraine, because Ukraine is absorbing vast amounts of weapons and dollars, etc. And because it's so corrupt, it's not really having a great effect on the field as much as anything else. So there may be a change in the attitude to Ukraine if Trump wins in the November elections, because Biden, I would find it very difficult to think that he can win the presidential election now. He's lost his base. People really don't want to vote for Butcher Biden anymore. So we shall see. But Israel, I mean, it will be crucial, without a doubt, because it's a stable settler base. And it has these links with Arab regimes, which can only exist through repression because, as Matthew said, they're incredibly unpopular. We saw that at the World Cup when, people were openly hostile to any Israeli presence there, much to their own surprise. They believed that Arab regimes being friendly to Israel therefore meant the people. And they got quite a shock that that wasn't the case, that Israel is hated everywhere for what it does. So yes, it's an incredibly unstable situation in the Middle East. And I'd further go along with suggest that although Israel is quite determined, despite what it says, to ethnically cleanse Gaza of the vast majority of its population, it may not get away with that because that will be one step too far. I may be wrong on that, but I would hazard a guess on that. But the amounts of people who are dying at the moment is horrific. And what Israel is doing is that, I mean, people will die more from disease and famine than they will actually from the bombs itself. So it is really a genocide and a Holocaust in the making as we speak. And that should be our main priority, really.
So, Tony, who do you think would stop Israel getting away with it then?
Well, it's a good question. I think the United States may be forced to pull the plug in the end because it's becoming too overt. It is quite interesting that multiple countries are now going to the ICJ and the and the International Criminal Court saying, well, look, you have this international human rights architecture and international law. What are you doing about it? Is it completely bankrupt? So it is throwing up a problem. And some countries like Belgium, for example, and Spain have not gone along with cutting the aid to UNRWA. Because, of course, what was the United States' response to the International Court judgment? To cut off food for the Palestinians. I mean, could you think of anything more genocidal than that? But some countries have not got along with that. And Israel bombed Belgium's main presence in Gaza City. It completely took out the building, you know, as to say, just to demonstrate their contempt for anyone who doesn't back them 100%. So that may start to cause eruptions even within the EU, which has been wholeheartedly in support of Israel, led by Germany, of course.
Of course.
Tony, could I just ask Tony a really quick question? I know it's a little tiny bit off
Go on,
point.
make it quick. Mhm.
Iran. Why does Iran want to, you know, this axis of resistance? What is Iran's interest in that? Being a real major player in terms of the resistance, as in Palestine at the moment, in terms of support for Hamas, Hezbollah.
Well, Iran hasn't chosen the role it's been assigned. It would have preferred to come to terms with imperialism, and it thought it had done with Obama. But of course, Trump overthrew everything, and Biden hasn't been prepared to reinstate what went before. Iran has interests. It is also, it has interest in, if you like, being a regional player. I won't say a hegemon, but certainly it has interest. And Israel wants to be the complete dominating regime and power in the Middle East. So that is what's the cause of this. It wasn't about nuclear power. That was always a red herring, because the agreement that Obama had reached would have stopped it progressing to a nuclear weapon. It was about the role of Iran in the Middle East, which is why Israel said it must be linked to the question of terrorism, which is another way of saying you don't support these different groups and movements, etc. So Iran has been forced to give support to the Houthis and to Hamas and others. And you see that in Iraq today, where, I mean, various militias are now confronting the United States. And that is what could blow the situation up if the United States gets drawn into a general war, which it fears, and other people fear as well. But I wouldn't hazard a guess as to what will be the eventual outcome.
Ian, please.
Good evening, comrades. Excellent discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I just wanted to make a couple of little points, really. First is about conspiracy theories. There is a ruling class. It really rules, and it does conspire. But to explain what is happening in the Middle East, or to explain US support for Israel on the basis of conspiracy theories, is, I think, false. Imperialism is the explanation, really. And also, you know, I would argue that the US, if it was in its interest to drop Israel like a hot potato, would drop Israel like a hot potato. South Africa, if people remember, I mean, growing up in London, and because of South Africa House being there, most of my active political life when I was younger, nobody gave a toss really about South Africa, apart from people who were genuinely on the left. And South Africa seemed to be almost invincible. But of course, once the Soviet Union had collapsed, once the money had gone from Consul Weseswick, once the South African Communist Party decided South Africa should be a safe place to make profits in, then apartheid was dispensable. And I think Israel would be dispensable under certain circumstances. There was an accusation of a kind of mechanical Marxism being waged here, as it were. Of course, this series has been going on for a little while, and I think if one looks at it in the round, I think that's completely false. I mean, Yasemin Mather, in talking about Arab nationalism, what we might today think of as the kind of progressive Arab nationalism in the period of the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, is an interesting point, isn't it? Because after all, if it was in the US interest to be friendly with Arab nations, as of course it is indeed already, but if you look at what was going on in the Arab world, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, with their kind of obstinate insistence that the resources of those countries said actually enrich those countries rather than be appropriated by the United States or whatever, then of course you have a completely different dynamic. And that's the point. This is a dynamic situation and far from being mechanical. On the question of rationality, whether it's rational to support Israel or rational to support whoever, generally speaking, the ruling class, as I say, does rule, and and they do talk to one another, and they are a far more cohesive class, arguably, than the proletariat at the moment. But they will do things which, on the face of it, might seem irrational. So let's take, for example, the bourgeoisie's support for Hitler. Bourgeoisie doesn't like fascism; it's bad for business. But in the context of a Germany which could potentially have had a revolution, which could have been a spark for a world revolution, then to have the SR prepared to go around and beat up communists is a very rational idea from a bourgeois point of view. Had Germany not potentially been the fulcrum for world revolution, then nobody would have given Hitler a second look. However, of course, things can sometimes get out of control, as Harold Macmillan, that great theorist of the left, was wont to say, events, dear boy, events. And things do get out of control. And same with the King David Hotel, for example. I mean, the little loyal Jewish Ulster turned around and decided it wanted to be independent. So attacking the King David Hotel was just a way of getting the Brits out a bit sooner. And it's an interesting dynamic as well, because by getting the Brits out a bit sooner, they could carry out the ethnic cleansing fully intended to. In a way, Britain, in its perfidious Albion state, was facing both ways. On the one hand, it was perfectly happy to have Israel as a client state, but on the other hand, in principle, had to defend the Arab population. But of course, it didn't, and actually aided in many cases, or at least turned a blind eye to the atrocities being committed by the Irgun and the Haganah and the Lehi and so on. So it is far from being mechanical. You can see the dynamism in all of it. I just wanted to say a couple of little things. Maybe, I mean, I'm interested about Egypt. You know, the logical thing, and I've heard some kind of conspiratorial ideas that somehow, if Egypt could just be prevailed to take all those people from Gaza, because after all, Gaza was part of Egypt at one time, they could just be relocated, and some of the funding from the gas fields could go to just building a new Bantustan somewhere in the Sinai Desert. The problem is, for Egypt, that you've got a huge population of people who won't forget that, and won't forget that betrayal. And the fear of losing Egypt as a loyal client state of US imperialism is also part of the dynamic. So I think that's really the only other thing I wanted to add was about this kind of genetic stuff. I mean, reading Shlomo Sand's books was really quite fascinating from my point of view. I don't think it really matters whether the Ashkenazim were descended from the Khazars or whatever else. It bears no relation on the current state of what's going on. But what Shlomo Sand did effectively, and what his powerful contribution really, was just to kind of debunk the whole foundation myths of Zionism. And from that point of view, I'm delighted to see it. I don't think any of the kind of silly nonsense about genetic testing of Central European Jews or anybody else is going to make the slightest difference one way or the other. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Who would like to reply? Or shall we have another?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Steve then. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, thank you, comrades. Obviously, it was been very interesting and all different angles on it. And also, you've got to remember that the two speakers were asked to talk mainly about America, the relationship between America and Israel. Obviously, in the discussion, we've widened it out a little bit beyond that. And that's not a criticism, because that was the brief, as it were, the speakers were given to concentrate on that. And in effect, missing out some of the wider issues by concentrating. But that's not a problem. But I think I've got 3 points I would like to raise. The first one is about 1945. And obviously, the Zionists at that time were anti-British. They were not anti-imperialist. They just wanted to get rid of Britain because that was their project, to establish a Zionist state. But they couldn't have achieved that, by the way, by their tactics, unless the balance of forces after the Second World War changed everything. Just in the same way that America wouldn't allow Britain to take control of Suez, the Americans and the Soviet Union, especially those two powers, were not going to allow Britain to keep its colonies. So you've got to see Britain's retreat from Palestine in the same way their retreat from India, Burma, Egypt, and their problems in Iran, all these other places. This is a part of the retreat of British. So in a way, the Zionists were pushing at an open door because Britain was being forced by wider circumstances to retreat, and it's that bigger picture. I think that's significant. Second thing, I mean, the other thing about 1945 was America was making a new deal with Saudi Arabia, and I still think Saudi Arabia's got Cheryl mentioned this as well, and other comrades, but Saudi Arabia, I think, is really important in this whole story. It's clear, or it seems to me anyway, that Blinken is trying to get Saudi Arabia in line for a two-state solution, or some version of a two-state solution. Because Saudi Arabia is a major ally. The Abraham Accord shows that they were trying to get Israel and Saudi Arabia into the same group against Iran, and they were nearly going to achieve that until, as some comrades said previously, until October the 7th blew that up. Now, Saudi Arabia can't get back into that position now unless something is done about two states. And that's what Blinken is concerned about. And as comrades have said, I've seen articles that mention Ramadan. They're very, very concerned that when I'm not quite sure when Ramadan is, but it's in a month or two's time. They're hoping to do a deal before then, because they're very concerned that as people come out onto the streets and at the time of Ramadan, there will be trouble brewing, even in places like Saudi Arabia. So I think that the situation is very difficult for the Americans, trying to span all of these balancing points. My last point was just an observation. I don't know whether Tony knows this one, he possibly does, but there was a treaty signed, I saw, between the UK and Saudi Arabia. No, it's UK and Israel, sorry. It's called the Roadmap for 2030. Have you come across that, Tony? I don't know if you have, but anyway, there's a trade deal, there's an education deal, there's a cultural deal. As I looked at this deal, apparently Israel supplies 1 in 7 of all our medicines are supplied by Israel. But in this deal that was signed, it includes in this deal combating delegitimization. Both countries are committed, it says here, to fighting all forms of anti-Semitism, including in its modern form, the delegitimization of the state of Israel as elaborated in the IHR definition. So it's actually written into a trade deal that the two countries are doing. It says down here, the UK reaffirms its objection to boycotts, divestment and sanctions campaigns. Such campaigns are at variance with the UK's government policy and are not only unfairly single out Israel, undermine efforts to advance Israeli-Palestinian dialogue and reconciliation, but contribute to the deplorable rise of anti-Semitism in the UK. The UK is committed to ending any such campaigns by public bodies. So this is in a trade deal signed by the Crown, by the UK and Israel in March this year. I think March last year, March 2023. It's worth looking it up because it's got lots of interesting things in it.
Thank you very much, Steve. Okay, that was our last contribution from the floor. I mean, I have to say the debate on camera is a lot healthier than what's going on in the chat, I'm afraid to say. So there's a lot of conspiracy stuff in the chat, and there must be probably a good reason why these comrades are not coming on the camera to say those things. But if any of you want to reply to some of those things or just have a little summation of our session tonight, we will be looking at the question of the solution to the situation in the Middle East in next week's sessions with Gada Kami, 1 state, 2 states, or something entirely different. So we can, let's not focus on that now, but let's focus on the question we've been discussing tonight. I suggest Roger, Matthew, Tony, in that order.
Fine.
Okay, I'm only going to make a few very general points. I think it's been a very wide-ranging discussion, a very interesting discussion, and I've learned something from it. I just want to make what I think is the basic point when we're talking about who is the tail wagging the dog or vice versa. The question is, let's just think what it may seem extraordinary at first sight that the USA is supporting and without question, supporting and arming and financing and giving absolute full backing to this genocide in Gaza and generally to the monstrous policies of the Israeli regime. But let's look at it this way: what would happen if the USA withdrew support? The whole cauldron would explode. The whole area is bubbling with ethnic conflict. Of course, the Palestinian issue overwhelmingly dwarfs all the others. But let's remember, we had, in any case, we've had, apart from the Palestinian issue, we had in the past, we've got sectarian conflicts and communal conflicts, which have been raging throughout the area ever since ever since the Second World War. Really, we've had the Lebanon Civil War, we've had massacres in Jordan, we've had now the sectarian divisions in Iraq. We've had the whole question of the Kurdish national repression in several countries. We've got the whole region is just simmering, and it would explode with any change to the balance of forces, and that's why the U.S. imperialism is in hock. Otherwise, the idea of there's some kind of the Zionist oligarchy. Well, I mean, that is all a factor. Of course, there are lobbies and there are interests and there are pressures and pressure groups and all the rest of it. But the point is, imperialism decides as it assesses the interests of imperialism and of capitalism and of its rule. And if Israel, if US withdrew support from Israel, there would be an absolute explosion and complete mayhem from their point of view. Therefore, what position do we need to take? Let's remember the reason all of this is really it's the unresolved issues that arose out of the end of the First World War, never mind the Second. The division of the area by the French and the British, the Sykes-Picot Plan, which simply drew arbitrary straight lines on the map, and it ended up leaving all these multiple communal issues raging throughout the whole area. So what should our position be on that? There's all this constant arguments about whether we want a one-state solution or a two-state solution or what. The point is that actually neither of those poses any viable solution, which could only end if it's left on those terms. It could only end with Israeli domination and another form of the slavery of the Palestinian people. But what we have to say is, as socialists, that the whole region, the whole map has to be redrawn. We have to say that we're in favour of a socialist federation of the Middle East, which could actually find which would be the only means of finding the beginning of a solution to all the national and communal and sectarian problems that are bubbling in the whole region. I think I'll leave it at that. So thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Roger. Matthew.
Yeah, I think obviously, I mean, it's quite clear, you know, that the Israelis are dependent on the US, and that they're, you know, okay, you know, clearly you see the interlinking of the two, and the fact, as I say, that it's now quite clear that the Biden administration actually supplied military, you know, staff to plan the assault on Gaza, to assist in planning on the assault on Gaza. It's that closely interlinked. You know, you could, I mean, you know, if you stand the Israelis up in court and say, you know, you're guilty, so the Biden administration absolutely, yeah, there with it. So that, hence why they were so agitated. But the core of this really is mass resistance. I mean, the problem they've got is you've got tens and hundreds of millions of people are saying they reject this barbarism and butchery on people's phones and computer screens. I mean, despite the rotten propagandists and their effort to stifle the thing, I mean, people can watch this war live in real time because there are people of genuine courage who will put it up there on social media, and so it's you know, in that way it's changing things. And you see, I mean, you know, really, I mean, the core, I mean, the real core of it then is, look, you look at the impact in the Arab countries, particularly obviously Egypt as the largest country, and you know, the if you like, the real sort of centre of gravity of the region. You know, I mean, the notion that al-Sisi could accept, you know, that he would form the other half of a deal with the Israelis to clean, ethnically cleanse Gaza, is unbelievable. He couldn't. There's just no way he could survive. You know, the explosion would be something else. I mean, they allowed. Because of mass pressure in Egypt, they allowed, you know, people to demonstrate, and the first place they went for, you know, in Cairo was Tahrir Square, despite the fact, of course, they were banned from going near the place. They managed to break through the lines. I mean, you know, okay, obviously a great cost to people who did, but I mean, it's you know, it's exactly, people understand exactly this, you know, and the slogans raised were not merely about Palestine. They were also the slogans of 2011, when they destroyed Mubarak's regime. You know, I mean, you know, they understand, people understand that these are the stakes. You know, and I mean, you know, you look at it. I mean, the Egyptian masses destroyed the Egyptian police force in one day. One day. The problem was it didn't have political leadership. You know, anyway. So I mean, in those terms, and you can see, I mean, even sort of countries like Kuwait. I mean, there's various people in Glasgow from these countries, and they actually show you things like in Kuwait, you know, an actual advertising poster, you know, an official one that says, "Have you killed a Palestinian today?" i.e., have you bought any of this stuff that's on the BDS list, you bastards? You know, and that's the feeling, you know, you know, simply there's just mass rejection. And it, you know, again, I mean, to say that it's destabilizing the whole area in those terms, and you can see that actually in the ICJ. I mean, the ICJ, you know, they always tell us your courts are not political, which of course is complete and utter bullshit. That the ICJ actually, the whole business of that initial ruling was completely political. It's completely the balance. I mean, you can see it. You know, the fact that, I mean, everybody can see this is a genocide. You know, I mean, any idiot looking at it for 5 minutes says this is a genocide, and therefore they were forced to find, at least to some degree, that it was a genocide. But they were obviously under pressure from the imperialist powers the other way, saying, well, you can't order a stop. They wouldn't order a stop. So you could see exactly the political balance just in that one judgment, you know, or in that one statement. It's extraordinary. And it will change. It will change everything. This, in those terms, and really, it is. Whether or not the imperialists and so on can survive, and it's not just in terms of what's happening in the Middle East. It's also what's happening in the US itself. The fact you've got a revolt in the US, you've got thousands of people on the street, despite the repression, the efforts to say people being sacked, McCarthyism, which are on a much worse scale than we've got here, people being persecuted, removed from their jobs, told that they won't get jobs, but people still come out. And the great thing about it, of course, is it's led by Jewish youth. This thing is led by Jewish youth, but then labelled as anti-Semites, which is extraordinary. It just shows you how degenerate the whole bloody process is. And the final thing I would say is that the other thing, of course, is that the one thing that really goes against the whole lot is the judgment on David Miller, which says in the face of everything which has been said about the IRHA and so on, that anti-Zionism, it does exist, it is political, and it has to be recognised under the 2000 Act as a protected belief, which is quite extraordinary in those terms. I mean, I think obviously you don't set store by these things, but it's an extraordinary judgment. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. It was a very important judgment, and it also shows whenever these accusations of anti-Semitism, most of them are obvious claptrap. We know it. We know there's been an attempt, a successful attempt to redefine what anti-Semitism is. But it comes even in front of a bourgeois court without, with all the limitation that comes up. We have no hope that justice is delivered in a bourgeois court, but it comes to a bourgeois court and it's laughed out of court. Employment tribunals where this is being caught. Stan Keeble as well had to have his job back, etc., etc. So it's laughable, but that's, they got away with it. They have been successful in their own terms, but we're fighting back, and that is a really important judgment. Thanks for bringing that up, Tony.
Yes, indeed. I think the first thing to say about the Palestinian struggle is that it's symbolic throughout the Arab region for the domination of that region by imperialism. And what does that mean in practice? It means that the vast wealth of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the others goes not into benefiting the people of those regions, but into benefiting imperialism itself through the petrodollars, and also, of course, the corrupt Saudi monarchy above all, and its waste of literally billions and billions of dollars. I mean, there is a very real, if you like, impoverishment of the region. And one of the reasons, one of the effects, certainly, of the war in Iraq was that, if you like, the health service and the very modern facilities that the Ba'athist regime, for all its crimes, did, it actually had a fairly, if you like, progressive health system and social security system. And all of that has gone by the way with the American occupation and the complete corruption for Blackwater and all the other US multinationals who've pillaged that country. So the Palestinians are really important to the Palestinian struggle because it symbolizes everything about imperialism's domination in the region. The other thing we should look at is Israel itself. Because in the last year, I think it was in January when the elections were, the settler right, the far right, messianic fundamentalist Jewish settlers came to power in Israel, represented by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And they are really a neo-Nazi, Judeo-Nazi right, for whom, no amount of Palestinian deaths is enough. I mean, they are genocidalists. And you would have thought that the American and British press would have picked up on these characters who are now running Israel. I mean, the spiritual mentor of Ben-Gvir, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is the police and security minister. He's not a minor figure. It is a Rabbi Dov Lior, chief of the West Bank rabbis, who is on record as saying that one Jewish fingernail is more valuable than 1,000 non-Jewish lives. And his hero is Baruch Goldstein, who committed a massacre in Hebron's Ibrahimi Mosque. And when Yaakov Perin, another rabbi, gave the funeral oration, he upped it from 1,000 to 1 million non-Jewish lives were worth less than a Jewish fingernail. So this gives you some idea of the kind of people in Israel. And yet the West has glossed over who it is who's driving the war in Israel. And we should be able to attribute this to really the propaganda press that we see, whether it's the BBC, which didn't cover the opening speech in the South African case, but managed to get in Israel's reply in real time. I mean, their bias is just overwhelming. So the very real divisions in Israel, in essence, between those who want a theocratic state and those who want some kind of secular racist state, which is what the demonstrations were really about, have come to the fore. Now, people, if you like, get hung up about Zionist oligarchs and Zionist lobbies and so on. Let me say this. Certainly, these lobbies are nasty, pernicious, malevolent, and should be fought whenever they raise their ugly head, whether it's UK Lawyers for Israel, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, the Anti-Defamation League, and so on. They are nasty, reactionary, semi-fascist, etc. But we should never forget the question, where do they get their power from? What gives them the ability to conduct the campaigns they do? And they are given that power, and they're given that power by our own ruling class. The Campaign Against Anti-Semitism would be nothing if they didn't have access to the hallways of the Home Office and Sue Braverman, as she was then, and probably the current Home Secretary as well. So that's what I say. To look at it simply as Zionist oligarchs is looking down the telescope through the wrong end. You're getting the wrong picture. They don't get their power independently or autonomously, or because even they're Jewish. It's because they have access to power because they operate in the interests of power, the power of imperialism. And we should not forget, I mean, when they go on about anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism is a very simple thing. I mean, my dad fought in the Battle of Cable Street. He was a Zionist, but most Zionists were opposed to anti-Semitism. He wasn't in the leadership. He didn't need a definition of anti-Semitism to know what it was he was fighting. Anti-Semitism is a very clear and obvious thing. It's someone who doesn't like or hates Jews as Jews. That's really all it is. It's hostility to Jews as Jews. You can look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's about 8 words. You don't need a 500-word definition in order to understand what anti-Semitism. What these people have done, of course, is twist anti-Semitism into a definition which will support our ruling classes. So it's no accident that some of the most anti-Semitic people in the world are those who now support or oppose anti-Semitism. The Tommy Robinsons, the Richard Spencers, the Donald Trumps, the Steve Bannons, and all the rest of it. Anti-Semitism has been weaponized by anti-Semites to use against people who are anti-racists. So it's no wonder at all today that the demonstrations, I mean, not only in the United States, but even in Britain, are now increasingly led by anti-Zionist Jewish youth. Jews against genocide in this country, the Jewish bloc on the demonstrations, etc. And they are pilloried as anti-Semitic. It's beyond parody in a sense. So we should junk all of this, and we should certainly oppose any attempt to infiltrate the IHRA into schools, which is what the Department of Education is currently doing. So I give that warning, and I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, comrades. Roger, Matthew, and Tony, brilliant contributions. Thank you for comrades of the audience who've participated. And we hope to see you all next week when we're talking with Gada Kami about, one-state solution, two-state solutions, or something entirely different. We're also adding one more session at the end on the drive to World War III, conscriptions, mental health issues of soldiers, etc. That'd be a very interesting discussion for sure. I'm convinced. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.